right. Okay, so hello everyone. We are at the second TMB meeting of the week, and we have today with us Gunnar Gronlid. I hope I didn't butcher the name.
That's right, that's good.
And he will be talking about ontological architectures and the limit of human knowledge, which I'm sure it's going to be a treat. Gunnar, you have the floor.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you guys very much for having me and for being here. Thank you, Karl, for the invitation. I'm very excited to be given this opportunity. Like you just mentioned, the title of my talk is Ontological Architectures and the Limit of Human Knowledge. Now, I'm going to be giving a bit of a disclaimer because I imagine that as far as people who've presented to you all before, and I've joined some of these meetings in the past, I am probably one of the least knowledgeable and non-experts in everything that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm not actually, I'm not currently a researcher who's doing research in any of these areas. I don't have a PhD or anything like that. I'm actually a journalist. And the reason why I'm presenting today is that I'm trying to write an article, which I'll get to into a second. I'll just tell you a little bit about me first. So I'm originally from Norway, the Telemark region, where I am right now on a little holiday. To give you some of my academic background, I do have a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Durham, where I was mainly studying the effects of language on color memory, which sort of got me introduced to Bayesian perception, and it's where I first heard about the free energy principle, sort of tangentially. I then went on to do a master's degree in neuroscience from the University College London. There I did a totally different kind of project. It was a psychopharmacological project, looking at how we can intervene basically in PTSD. We did a sort of model PTSD study, looking at intrusive memory formation and the like. And after that, I went to work at the Beckley Foundation, which some of you may know of. It's a research charity that funds and initiates studies into psychedelics. And again, kept sort of reading more and more about the free energy principle and things like that while I was there as a researcher and doing communications and stuff for them. And then since then, I've actually become, like I said, I've become a journalist. So right now I'm writing for a magazine called Monocle, and I'm also a producer for their radio programs. And Monocle basically does everything from geopolitics to arts, design, culture, and all that kind of stuff. Annoyingly for me, they don't do a lot of science, so I've gotten to do some, but this is basically, this whole article that I'm trying to do right now is me trying to take my journalism and actually get to write about science. So I've pitched a piece to this magazine that you see on the right called Noema, and that's how this whole thing started. They also do geopolitics and the like, but they also do science and philosophy. And so the way that this all started, basically because this particular magazine, they're very interested in politics, geopolitics and the like. I basically came to Karl Friston and I asked him, whether the free energy principle can sort of be applied to systems that humans are sort of nested within, as opposed to just the human brain, because like a lot of people, I first encountered the free energy principle in terms of how it's used for the human brain. But it's the sort of scale invariance that really drew my interest, continue to draw my interest. And then after speaking to Karl, I spoke to a few more scientists, which I'll show you in a second. Through that and more reading, and especially sort of learning more about how the free energy principle scales, I've become more interested in sort of probing what the free energy principle tells us about the nature of reality more broadly and more deeply. And yeah, like I said, particularly about how the free energy principle scales. So one of the main questions and the reason why it has the title that it has is I've become curious if we can sort of conceive of nature itself as a process that essentially builds and creates these, what I call ontological architectures, that allows cognition and existence to take place at ever higher levels. And we'll start to expand upon that as we go through the talk. Just to keep in mind throughout the talk, these are basically the three central questions that I'm trying to address in this article. They are: one, is the universe fundamentally mechanistic, or is it informational / cognitive? Number two, might humans be nested inside of higher scale cognitive systems in the same way that, for example, cells are nested within the human scale? And if that is the case, if humans are nested within higher scale systems, does this imply a limit to human knowledge, or have humans reached a privileged cognitive positions where all knowledge is basically attainable? So to give you sort of the structure of the talk, like I said, I spoke to Karl Friston, and then he very kindly introduced me to the biologist Michael Levin, who I'm sure many of you know of, his work on bioelectricity and his interest in sort of how cognition scales and collective intelligence and that sort of thing. And then through both of them reading their papers, and especially Michael mentioning him repeatedly throughout our conversation, I became very interested in Chris Fields, the physicist, theoretical physicist. So I spoke with him as well. And so the structure of the talk will basically be, I'm going to sort of walk you through the conversations that I had with these three scientists. And all of this will sort of build up around these three central questions that I told you about earlier. And then in addition to that, I'll be giving a little nod to the theoretical physicist David Deutsch, who I'm sure many of you know of as basically the father of quantum computers. And he's also the author of these two really good books, The Fabric of Reality and The Beginning of Everything. And his thoughts, he has a very sort of thorough, rigorous epistemology about how knowledge works, how knowledge is created, and how we build knowledge scientifically and otherwise. And that will relate a lot to especially the last question that I asked earlier about what can actually humans know. So without further ado, I'll just get right into sort of talking about these conversations, and we'll start off with Karl Friston and the free energy principle. Like I mentioned, I first encountered the free energy principle in terms of how it's applied in neuroscience. And I think the neuroscience aspect of the free energy principle is still the one that's sort of been more widely adopted. If you read sort of popular magazines that ever interview Karl or talk about the free energy principle, they talk mainly about the neuroscience part, how it works in terms of how the brain is organized. And what it sort of says there, I know I don't really need to explain this to most of you, but I'll just go through my thinking in the conversation that I've had. So basically says that the way the brain is organized and its operations are basically in service of reducing uncertainty or surprise about itself in relation to its environment by making predictions on the basis of a generative model, this model being constantly updated by sensory data that it receives from its environment. Now, where it became really interesting to me, like I said, is when I started to read about how Karl has applied this to fundamental physics and systems at every scale. And here he sort of defines the free energy principle more broadly. He says that it's a theory of everything that can be distinguished from other things in a statistical sense. And a thing here is simply a non-equilibrium steady state system that persists for a non-trivial amount of time. And the statistical independencies of these things are very importantly mediated by this beautiful notion of a Markov blanket that keeps the external states and the internal states separated, and then have those external internal states interact through sensory states and active states. And he says that this allows one to interpret the internal states of something as representing and making inferences about its external states, which of course we can more easily imagine with the brain, that what the brain is doing is it's making inferences and theories about the world. But it becomes very, very fascinating when you start to think of this as this is actually what systems at every scale are doing. It is not actually just relegated to human brains. So like I said, the really interesting part about the free energy principle is that it is scale invariant. It should be equally apt to describe a brain as it should smaller scale systems like a cell or atom. And indeed, and the reason why I spoke to Karl originally is that it should also yield larger scale systems like a population or environment should also yield to a free energy formulation. Even more abstract things, at least when I spoke to Karl, he even mentioned words like ideologies might even be able to be explained through the free energy principle. So we can, for example, apply this to nations. If you look at a country like Japan throughout history, and you take the notion of a Markov blanket, and you think of that as just the simple border of Japan, at different points in history, Japan was actually made up of many different warring tribes that were fighting against each other and were not unified. And so each of these can also be sort of partitioned by different Markov blankets. And of course, even today, Japan consists basically of blankets within blankets within blankets of different communities and different subregions. And these types of partitionings, sort of very importantly, can fluctuate and change across time. So Friston said, here's a quote from him, that looking at self-organization at different scales, we can predict mathematically that the fluctuation of the Markov blankets is faster the smaller they are. So if you got a border of Japan and you have loads of warring tribes within Japan, you would predict that the internal borders amongst the warring tribes would come and go on a faster time scale than the border of the larger system, fully acknowledging that that border itself may also fluctuate. And then you can sort of build this further upwards. You can go right up to a conception of like Gaia or a biosphere level Markov blanket. And you can see that as a very slowly fluctuating blanket, whilst as you go downwards through the climate, through geopolitical structures, right down to just what you experience in your day-to-day life, you would see those blankets sort of start to fluctuate faster and faster. And Karl called this, he said that there is a lawful ascension of temporal scales that you get when you think about Markov blankets within Markov blankets. Markov blankets that are bigger last longer, or Markov blankets that are smaller are usually more transient. Now, one of the key features, because I asked Karl if we wanted to sort of give a useful perspective for, let's say, political scientists and the like to think about, well, how should actually a society be structured? Or for business administrators, how should a business be structured usefully in order for it to persist across time and actually last and survive? One of the key features that such a system has to possess is sparse connectivity. This is one of the sort of beautiful things about the brain, is that if you actually look at how the brain is connected, you're not seeing that, you know, every part of the brain is massively connected to every other part. You're seeing the sparse connectivity where different nodes are basically sort of connected a little bit to the next node, a little bit to the next node. And you can see a picture here just to draw a little bit back to my psychedelics days. This is from a study that was done by Imperial College London that looked at brain imaging of people taking psychedelics. And it's very interesting that what actually seems to happen when you take a psychedelic is that the activity of your brain becomes more entropic. Basically, the free energy sort of increases and the whole brain starts to connect a lot more. So this sparse connectivity actually temporarily goes down and you have this massively connected brain that then reorganizes itself afterwards. And I spoke to Karl a little bit about this in terms of globalization, the sort of trend in society now that, you know, the whole world is becoming increasingly more and more connected, because I began to, you know, this is sort of like a big dream, you know, of a few decades ago, is that we would become this beautiful global society where everyone is massively connected to each other. So when I asked him about this, he said, if you ask in a sort of Zuckerberg or in a sort of Facebook sense, is connectivity a good thing? He said, in my world, it's really bad. So mass connectivity is basically an inversion of the truism that for things to exist, they must be sparsely connected. If you don't have sparse connectivity, you're just left with a soup. So no sparse coupling basically means no Markov blanket, which translates to the death, decay, or dissipation of a system. If you communicate all of your information out into the world, that's the equivalence of you basically dying. And in information theoretic terms, you can say that the reason why sparsity is essential is because it minimizes the complexity in terms of the computational costs of the message passing within and between systems. And a lack of sparse connectivity will therefore lead to greater coarse-grainedness before eventually just turning you into a soup. Another thing that he pointed out to me then, which I thought was really interesting if we think about free energy principle applied to high scale systems, is that if you get a system that becomes sort of higher, more and more coarse-grained, the only sustainable solution in the end is that you get this sort of 50-50 split within the system. So instead of having, say in politics, lots of different parties that you can identify with politically, the only thing that can really sustain itself across time is the sort of 50-50 split, which of course is, seems to tell an interesting story about this sort of polarization and left-right divide in politics that we often see today, and that actually a kind of mass globalization and too much communication might actually be one of the explanatory factors of why we see that kind of polarization in society. So if this sort of lack of sparse connectivity just keeps getting worse and worse, you might also be able to reasonably predict that eventually the system, for example, a nation, would collapse and split apart into many other systems. So the current sort of, I guess you can say, a sort of rebellion against globalization that we're seeing now is a mass sort of deglobalization, this sort of trend towards sort of hyper-reaction of populism, isolationism, and so on, can be seen as a sort of systemic counter-reaction against the kind of connectivity that, if it was left unchecked, would potentially lead to a sort of death of the larger system. I'm going to move on now to my conversation with Chris Fields, because after speaking with Karl, and I did actually speak with Levin before Chris, but I became very interested in sort of how far down does this go? How far does this notion that what we're actually looking at when we're looking at these systems is sort of a form of cognition, and that where does the free energy actually apply? How deeply does it apply? And so Chris gave me a little bit of background into this notion that physics is, in fact, at the deepest level, basically information processing. And he took it back to Boltzmann in the 1870s. So what he did was he related the notion of entropy to uncertainty. And that language, of course, will not sound unfamiliar to you guys working on the free energy principle and active inference. So he defined entropy, Chris said, in terms of the number of states that a system can have that an observer can't distinguish. What he did was represent energy or entropy in terms of ignorance or uncertainty. And importantly here, in terms of misconceptions that people often have when they hear observer in terms of quantum physics and so on. So an observer does not mean observer like us humans. It's merely a system that's interacting with an environment. So this observer, or simply a thing that exists in, I think, Karl Friston's language, can be cast as something that is conditionally statistically independent from its environment. And in quantum theory language, a thing exists if it exists in a way that is not entangled with its environment. And what entanglement basically is an absence of conditional statistical independence. He also told me that entanglement is not ontological, it's observer relative, which I think speaks to when I spoke to Karl. He talked about how Markov blankets can be drawn in many, many different ways, depending on how you're looking at a system. It's not like there's one fixed Markov blanket that you can very clearly define all the way up. There's all kinds of ways that you can draw Markov blankets, and they can overlap with each other. So this act of sort of decreasing uncertainty about another system as we meet other systems in our environment, decreasing our uncertainty about them requires energy, because it requires you to interact with that system. Also told me that Friston's notion of the Markov blanket is actually akin to an older physics idea of a holographic screen, part of the holographic principle. I know from reading briefly that one of the main things that people sort of take from the holographic principle is that the universe could actually be this sort of 2D universe that then sort of holographically projects into a 3D world, the way that we see it. But the way that Chris expressed the idea to me in relation to what we were talking about, this was first enunciated by Jared T. Houghton. He said, if you have a system and this system has a boundary, then the most you can know about that system is the information that's encoded on the boundary. Furthermore, what the principle adds to that is that the amount of information that can be known based on what's on the boundary is by definition finite, because the information that's flowing out of the boundary requires a kind of physical carrier that can get through it. You guys probably understand this a lot better than me. I do not have a physics background, but this apparently relates to the Planck constant, which Chris told me is sort of the smallest dimension on the boundary that one photon can get through. And the Planck constant is also how we know that sort of the universe appears to be made up of discrete quantized packets of energy, as opposed to being a continuous universe. Now, what Chris told me is that what's interesting is that once you have this notion of what separates different systems from their environments, you can begin to identify and characterize systems based on their state/problem spaces. Again, a concept that I think you guys understand a lot better than me, the idea of state spaces. But basically, any different system has a kind of topology of states that it can be in, has a different number of states that it can exist within. We as individuals can exist in a number of different states. And depending on what kind of system you are, you basically have a different topology of states that you can enter. And you'll be sort of attracted towards these, what are called attractors. You'll be sort of drawn to revisit these different types of attractors in your state space. And so you can begin to ask questions like, what can an E. coli understand about its environment given the kind of problem space it has access to? What can an electron understand about its environment? And what can an organ understand about its environment? And we can go up into the higher scales, of course, and ask about ecosystems or about societies that sort of contain other societies or ecosystems, plus the whole planet, plus the entire universe. And what can we actually think that these systems can understand? And once you have this sort of formulation again of information and behavior, you can start to use psychological or behavioral language to actually describe things that are happening in biology or physics, all these different levels of explanation. You say that these systems have communication, cooperation, competition. They can exhibit things like deceptive signaling to fool other systems and the like. Now, a question that I had for Chris Fields at this point, which was one of the main things that I wanted to ask him as a fundamental physicist, is sort of about this question of the way that we're taught about physics in high school, at least the way that I was taught about it. We're sort of taught that there's a kind of billiard ball kind of causation to how the universe works, right? That you have basically objects out there in the world and they're driven by different forces and energies. And if you have, like say, a billiard ball smashes into another billiard ball with a particular velocity and so on, it'll shoot off in that direction or in that direction. But this whole formulation of physics is information processing, and what's actually happening is that different systems are exchanging information. Seemed to me like it would imply that that kind of causation does not exist. Chris Fields seemed to agree with that. And he then told me about the free will theorem papers, which I thought was very interesting to sort of explore this topic a little bit, which his interpretation, at least, of the free will theorem is that if two systems are interacting, for example, a physicist interacting with a particle, and if one of them is regarded as having free will in a particular sense, meaning it's regarded as not being controlled by the causal forces that are local to it, then the other system also can't be regarded as being causally determined either. So the theorem basically says if anything has free will, everything does. And again, you guys might know about this paper much more than me, but my understanding is that they basically proved this idea quite well mathematically. So if we sort of want to say that we as human beings, we as scientists have free will or have a sort of minds of or a mind or consciousness or what have you, then you have to sort of yield to the idea that everything else does. All these systems that we are looking at and studying also have to have free will. Now, can this also mean, again, so this is the question that I have at the end there, does this sort of mean that everything down to fundamental physics have what we might call cognition? And this leads me into looking at the thought of Michael Levin, who I think would subscribe to that idea that basically the world is fundamentally cognitive. What he told me at the beginning of our conversation is that what I am interested in is principles by which minds scale in the physical world. Specifically, he's interested in the kind of cognitive glue, as he calls it, that allows individual parts, like, for example, cells, to combine at scale to support high scale, sort of higher order being, like, say, a human that has its own memories, preferences, goals, and other skills that do not belong to any of its components. So his idea is basically that as you scale, as the universe scales from particles through molecules, etc., every time you jump up a scale, you're basically creating a new kind of cognitive agent that has new abilities. And this is basically what collective intelligence is, right? We as human beings are a collective intelligence who are made up of billions and billions of cells. And Levin's notion is that these cells themselves have a kind of intelligence. They are actually minds. And this notion of scales, in this sense, is a kind of antidote to reductionism. So you can't use theories about systems at a particular scale to explain what's going on at a molecular, cellular, neuronal, or cell scale. So if in science, certainly when I was studying psychology, for example, say, the right scale of how to look at psychology is to look at neural networks, or it's to look at individual neurons, or it's to go all the way down to fundamental physics. Basically, you can't do that. Every time you scale, this new system, this new agent gains new capabilities that aren't explained by the individual parts. So you have to come up with new explanations that explain things that happen at the scale that you're looking at. So the main, of course, part of Michael's work, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, sort of challenges this sort of old view, again, kind of the sort of high school biology view that we're kind of taught, which is this view that DNA is like an organism's kind of instruction manual, right? That it sort of tells the organism how to create itself, how to build itself, how to build an arm, how to build a face. But the new view, which is especially sort of enlightened by Michael Levin's research, is that what DNA really does is it encodes for protein hardware, but it doesn't encode for form. In other words, morphogenesis. Morphogenesis is actually instead linked by bioelectricity. Again, I'm skipping over a little bit here, but basically he says that the DNA is a little bit like a brick factory. It produces the building material, can't tell the material how to arrange itself into complex structures. So the way that cell groups actually know what to build and how to stop the process of building once it's at the right stage is bioelectricity. And what's interesting there is that bioelectricity was kind of largely ignored for many, many years until Michael Levin picked it up again. We've often sort of thought that, this ability of neurons to communicate electrically was a special feature of neurons. But what Michael Levin has showed is that actually this is a much more ancient system of communications, which all the other cells in our bodies actually have, and which are essential to how our cells actually self-assemble into higher scale organisms. And I'll show you a little bit of the cool stuff that Michael Levin has found. So one of the main things that we sort of see is that, like I said, genetics, what they create is it's more complex than a brick, of course. They're basically creating machinery that can navigate anatomical problem spaces as intelligent agents, capable of recognizing unexpected states and taking corrective actions in order to reach a desired end state. So one example that Michael gave me is these Picasso tadpoles that they created. So, normally you have a sort of tadpole that's in early development, and it has the eyes and the face and all of that sort of roughly in the correct place. But what they did is they sort of scrambled the tadpole, so the eye is all messed up, it's all the way back here, the tail is all messed up, whatever. All these different anatomical features are basically in the wrong place. And if you follow the notion of DNA being an instruction manual that just says step by step, go here, go here, go here, and then you have a face, then it wouldn't be able to solve this problem, right? It would probably turn into a very messed up frog. But instead, what they were able to show is that this Picasso-like tadpole frog, given some time to develop, it'll intelligently basically move the eyes into the correct position and become a fairly normal tadpole. And this sort of very, very cognitive, seemingly intelligent morphogenetic process, like I said, is mediated by bioelectricity. So cells that become linked into a bioelectrical network become seemingly capable of modeling forms and then guiding cells towards those forms through a process of error correction, very much following the free energy principle, until it reaches an end state. So you can see in the sort of middle pictures there, what you're seeing is actually in the early embryonic phase, when you just have a cluster of cells that haven't actually become anything yet. It's just a bunch of cells that aren't anything. But once they link up and become a bioelectrical network, they become capable of, you can actually take a picture of this, they'll fire, and the firing pattern will actually make a face. So it seems as if the electrical network is actually modeling a particular shape that it then wants the cells to later shape themselves into and become. And interestingly as well, what this is sort of illuminated about how cancer works is that now we sort of understand, based on Michael Levin's work and his colleagues, that what a cancer actually is basically a cell that has become decoupled from the electrical network. So a cell doesn't need to be, a cancer cell doesn't need to be the case where it's something wrong with the cell fundamentally, like the cell is broken. It doesn't actually have to be that. It just has to be, it can be a completely normal cell. It functions as a cell should, but it's disconnected from the rest of the bioelectrical network. And therefore it starts to treat all the other cells around it as its environment, basically. So instead of seeing the other cells around it as part of itself, it starts to see the cells around it as environment. And then it starts to do what cells normally do, which is they just self-replicate and metastasize and so on. Also very interesting then is that Levin and his colleagues have actually found ways to probe these bioelectricity-mediated patterns to make organisms take on new forms that they normally wouldn't. So they can do different things to the ion channels and things like that in these creatures to basically sort of remap this state space topology that we were talking about earlier, so that the organism basically wants to become something else. So for example, they've often used planarian as a model. They've caused planarian to grow 2 heads instead of 1, and also, and this one always absolutely blows my mind. I don't understand how this is real. They can also make them grow heads that would normally belong to species that are separated by millions of years of evolution, which you can see in some of those bottom pictures there. You basically see that they'll cut off the head and they'll perturb the network, this bioelectrical network, in particular ways. And then suddenly, without, again, the genetics are all totally the same. The planarian will grow out this head that has these horns or that has different features that belong to a different species. that it's related to, but that it's separated by millions of years of evolution, which I think is just absolutely incredible. So the same hardware is basically capable of listing all kinds of attractors in what Levin calls anatomical state space. What's really interesting about that as well is, and which speaks to the intelligence of these systems, is that the lower level scales don't actually have to be micromanaged. You don't have to tell all of the cells what to do in order to do this. You just have to perturb the system at the scale you're interested in, and then the scales below seem to know what to do once they've received these higher level instructions. And then they just go on and do what they do very intelligently. I asked Michael, this is a very sort of speculative part, because I asked him, where the hell are these morphogenetic schematics and memories actually stored? And he told me that this is still very much unknown, and if he did have an answer to it, he'd probably have a Nobel Prize. But he did have a theory that he told me, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So here's what he said. He said, I think to some extent we're asking the same question that Plato and Pythagoras asked. We see patterns that don't necessarily encode in this space. What happens in this space is that you enable patterns to embody, but the patterns themselves are not here, they are elsewhere. He gave me a few examples of this as well. So you guys might have seen this before, like a Galton board, which is just, a wooden board with a bunch of nails in it, and then you sort of send these marbles down it. And you always end up getting this sort of perfect Gaussian distribution. And he gave the example of that and said, well, where's the Gaussian shape stored in nature? It's not stored in the board. You can't tell if this shape will come out based on the board or the nails or the marbles, but this shape just sort of exists. Well, where does it exist? A second example he gave is the sort of Pythagorean angles of a triangle, or logic gates that turn into truth tables. So give an example. You can imagine a sort of evolutionary process in which evolution sort of blindly goes through these different spaces, and let's say it discovers one angle of a triangle, and then it keeps exploring for a while and finds another angle of the triangle. Well, it can actually, at that point, it can actually stop exploring, because it doesn't have to now do all the work in order to find the third angle. By knowing the first two angles, you already have the third angle. I think the even more interesting example, again, is that if an evolutionary process over time created transistors, let's say AND gates, OR gates, special NAND gates, and so on, you automatically then get truth table out of that. You don't have to create the truth table. The truth table comes as a sort of free lunch from having created the basic machinery. So once you've created the basic machinery, now this whole space of possibility opens up to you, of computation and so on, which of course is what our neurons are doing, what our cells are doing with ion channels and so on. They basically are creating these types of truth tables, and once they have access to that, there's a whole new sort of realm that opens up to that system. So one way to think about this stuff, Michael says, is that what evolution is actually doing is searching through the Platonic space of possible patterns that will become useful. Systems at each of these scales can actually be most usefully thought of, again, looking at the previous work that I've been talking about, as intelligent agents that are on a cognitive spectrum. And Michael pointed out to me that he believes that there is no zero on this scale. There's no such thing as no intelligence in existence. Even fundamental particles show some basic form of cognition through things like least action principles and in following the free energy principle. So we get now to the title of my talk, Ontological Architectures. So based on all these conversations, sort of the impression that I've gotten from it is that we can see that as systems scale, new problem spaces become accessible, new affordances become available, and new actions, perceptions, and knowledge possible. And so my sort of question then is it reasonable to think of nature itself as a kind of process that builds and creates ontological architectures that then allow cognition and basically existence itself to take place at ever higher levels? And if this is the case, is there any reason to think that there is a limit to this upward movement? Is there any reason to think that we as human beings, for example, would be at the top or anything like that? And also, does the free energy principle, this is sort of my question for you guys, does the free energy principle give any indication that nature itself is actually driven upwards through these scales, or is it merely a kind of random process that it stumbles upon through a series of accidents? Also wondering, can cognitive agents at any given scale ever have complete knowledge of the systems that exist at scales above itself. You know, if we're talking about cells, it doesn't seem obvious that any of the individual cells inside my body have any idea that they right now are contributing to a higher order being giving this presentation. And I wonder if things are similar for us as human beings to a higher level scale. But I think there's other thoughts as well, maybe based on the fact that, you know, we seem to have this thing called science and we can sort of explain things and have theories. Might human beings actually be in a privileged position to attain knowledge, not only about the systems that exist at scales below our own, which we seem to be able to do, but also about systems above us? Of course, this is kind of interesting to point out because I said before that cells don't seem to know that they're contributing to the scales above them, but it's not clear that they know about the scales below them either. Whereas we, as human beings, seem to be capable of probing these systems that exist within us. But it still isn't clear that we can do it for high scale. So science obviously has been extremely successful up to this point in physics, chemistry, biology, so on. And it sort of becomes less and less successful the higher up you go. You know, people still sort of argue about, is psychology actually a science? And then I think people generally agree sociology has not reached that point, economics has not reached that point, political science has not reached the point of being something you could call a rigorous science. So it seems to be very difficult to really start to build a scientific theory about things that exist above our scales. And could there maybe also be a kind of Gödel limit on what can be known about those higher scale systems? Is there actually kind of a fundamental limit to what can be known, given that we, as the knowing creature, is embedded in the scale that we're embedded in? I asked this question to both Chris Fields and Levin. I didn't actually formulate this question until after I'd spoken to Karl Friston. And here's what they told me. So Fields said, I think that's a real open question. It's not really clear whether we can. It's not clear whether we can't. It's not clear whether we've tried. And I'm not sure yet if we know how to talk about that question. He did say that it might be that we can construct computational infrastructures that can interact with high systems and so on in a way that allows us to produce theories and models that we couldn't otherwise produce. And he points out to, for example, the fact that when we invented writing and other technologies, that did give us new, basically access to new knowledge. It's like Einstein said, I believe, that, you know, I and my pen are smarter than I alone, or something like that. And when I asked Michael Levin, he seems very positive. He thinks we absolutely can have a science of it, and we must have a science of it. I think there might be some sort of Gödel theorem around this idea that you can never truly know, but I'm sure that we can have a science that gives you some guidance. And an interesting idea that he floated around to me here is that if we did have a science, or at least we could sort of do some experiments to look at what a higher scale system above us might be doing, we might start to see patterns that would look to us like a kind of Jungian synchronicity. So you would see patterns happening where we ourselves could not see the obvious physically causative links between them, but the pattern would be suggestive of a higher level system. Now, as I promised, I would give a nod to David Deutsch, and I will let you know right away that this is the part where I understand the least, because this relies very, very heavily on a deep understanding of computation and of how computers work, which I do not. I do not have enough of a background in there, so I hope you guys can help me out a little bit here. But as of a few months ago, I was reading David Deutsch, and I was asking these questions, and perfect timing, because Deutsch is very, very critical of this idea that there might be knowledge that is unattainable by humans. He completely disagrees with this idea, and he thinks that humans can attain any knowledge. So, for example, he was in his book, he's very critical of astrophysicist Martin Rees, who speculated that elsewhere in the universe, there could be life and intelligence in forms that we can't conceive of. Just as a chimpanzee can't understand quantum theory, it could be that there are aspects of reality that are beyond the capacity of our brains. But David Deutsch thinks that any claim that there might be aspects of reality which are fundamentally incomprehensible to us is tantamount to an appeal to the supernatural. His sort of his explanation for why he thinks so. He says that it is humans' abilities to create explanations which allow us to surpass kinds of limitations. Humans are the only beings we know of that are capable of generating explanatory knowledge, which underlies the scientific process. And also, I think, interestingly, for our discussion about the free energy principle, he says it's a non-Bayesian form of knowledge. So it's not based on a sort of Bayesian inference kind of learning, He says scientific theories are judged by their explanatory power, not their probability or their statistical likelihood. Explanations, therefore, also overcome the problem of induction. Explanatory knowledge is accessible to us humans because we are universal computers of the kind that was formulated by Alan Turing. So you might know that Deutsch extended the Church-Turing principle into the Church-Turing-Deutsch principle, which is just a sort of stronger version of the Church-Turing principle, which says that a universal computer can simulate any physical process that exists in the universe. So Deutsch says that Alan Turing already proved in the 1930s that a universal Turing machine is possible, and that such a machine can be implemented in a variety of substrates. It's of course sort of like the dream of a general artificial intelligence. And a universal Turing machine can literally compute anything that is computable. In other words, it can run the computations of any process in the universe. And this computational universality rests on the laws of physics. This is sort of a very important part that David points out, is that the theory of computation is not a theory that is separate from the laws of physics. The theory of computation is basically a theory of physics, and therefore it is fundamental to how the world works. And because humans are such a universal computer, which I still haven't fully understood his argument for why we are, but his argument anyway is that we are such a universal computer. Therefore, anything that's permitted by the laws of physics can be built and known by humans. So here's some quotes for him, just to sort of expand upon this a little bit. Let's see if I can move this panel a little bit so I can actually see my notes. There we go. So there are several ways of putting this. For example, a computer can mimic any physical object, or a computer can perform the computations that any other computer can perform. Turing is saying whatever it can compute is a subset. So Turing is saying that whatever it can compute is a subset of what Turing machines can compute. And Turing machines are the ultimate. There's nothing beyond that. So people don't really get this universality of explanation that David is talking about because they don't understand the universality of computation. They don't understand that if someone says, well, what if aliens came from Alpha Centauri and they have better computers than us? Well, that's impossible. They can't have computers that are, they can have computers that are faster and that have more memory, but that's it. Our computers are the limit of what can be computed by anything in the universe. So systems like atoms and trees, etc., they are also computers that are running computations, but their computational repertoire is limited. The repertoire of a universal computer, including humans, on the other hand, is infinite. The only limiting factor, therefore, to our understanding of how the universe works is speed and memory, which can be overcome with technology, especially computers that can automate the processing of facts. Again, the Einstein quote, "My pencil and I are more clever than I." This has always been a part of how humans have developed knowledge, is to use technology to aid us. How does this relate then to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which he proved that no formal system that contains arithmetic can be both consistent and complete? There are truth statements that can't be proven, and there's also false statements that are provable. And when I talked to Chris Fields about this, he argued that what this means is that no system with finite capabilities can fully describe its environment, and that no system with finite capabilities can fully describe itself. But what Deutsch argues is, again, he brings in this sort of special thing that humans have, which is explanatory universality, which allows humans to surpass the sort of Gödel limit. We can basically use creativity and explanation to go outside of any given system and therefore gain any knowledge. The humans, in other words, are in a privileged position to go beyond Gödel's limit. We can simply create new knowledge and explanations or build new systems that overcome this incompleteness. This process of creating ever deeper knowledge is also infinite, hence the title of his other book, The Beginning of Infinity. And that brings me back, finally, to the final questions. I feel like I've been talking forever. The final questions, the questions of this that I want to address here, again, are, is the universe fundamentally mechanistic, or is it informational cognitive? Might humans be nested inside high-scale cognitive systems in the same manner that, for example, cells are nested within the human scale? And if so, does this imply that there's a limit to human knowledge, or have humans reached a privileged cognitive position where all knowledge is attainable? I'm really curious to get all of your opinions on these different things and what you think the free energy principle says about these different problems. Particularly curious about what you guys think about David Deutsch's arguments. I do hope that I presented those well enough to be a basis for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gunnar, for this tour de force. So I invite all of us to unmute ourselves and give Gunnar a round of applause. Thank you everyone. So now we can initiate the Q&A session. And if there are any questions from the audience, please go ahead and ask. There are no wrong questions. And while people collect their thoughts, maybe I will venture one. There were so many things to choose from, Gunnar, but I'm not sure what to choose. But I will ask something about the consistency of the ideas that you're presenting. So without assuming you know the answer, just I'm curious how you square the idea that Michael Levin invoked of the way in which evolution probes the space of Platonic forms to find the archetype that works in a certain configuration to guide the morphogenetic process, with Deutsch's idea that ultimately all abstract reasoning and all abstract forms are objective because they inherit from the way they are connected to physical, concrete things, including symbols. So the objectivity of mathematics in itself derives from the objectivity of physics. So that's a strongly anti-Platonic view of what's going on. So in that sense, if we go via the Deutsch route, we cannot appeal to those kind of endpoints to the morphogenetic process. So it remains quite quasi-mysterious what then drives the self-organization at that scale without it being programmed before.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's a complete mystery to me, and I mean it still remains a mystery to Michael Levin as well, right? That's why this is kind of like a very tentative suggestion that perhaps Plato was onto something when he was talking about these forms. But again, the reason why I'm very interested in David Deutsch's argument is because when I first read about it, I found it, I almost felt myself sort of instinctually a bit sort of repulsed by it, because my instinct sort of reading about Levin and reading about these different formulations, also about the energy principle, and particularly about sort of embodied cognition and how important being embodied in a particular kind of body actually is to basically to your knowledge, to your understanding, your relationship to your environment, so on. The idea that we as humans can know everything just seemed sort of inherently arrogant. And yet, when you read Deutsch, he is just such an absolute genius that you sort of have to take the idea seriously. That's why I'm very, very interested in it. And that's why I'm interested in sort of hearing you guys' arguments, because when he says that humans are universal computers, I haven't understood, for example, his arguments of why we are. And I also don't understand, because I'm not good enough for computation yet. I don't understand exactly what it means for computers to be universal and able to compute any process.
It's simply something that follows from how Turing defined computation in the 1934 paper, I think. So if you can implement any arbitrary function in a controlled sequence by sequence manner, following some specified rules, and you reached an end state, you can be considered a universal computer. And universality is quite cheap. It's not that complicated to get a classical universal computer. Classical in the way Turing defined it. So classical means kind of relying on sort of the classical physics as an intuition, but not quantum universal computer.
Quantum computers,
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense,
I wonder how this relates to, again, sort of this idea of embodied cognition. Then, because you can have you can use a number of different substrates to create a universal Turing machine, and yet sort of reading, I think both papers by Karl. I think Karl's talked quite a lot about this idea of embodied cognition. So on the fact that you need a body to actually become like a cognitive agent, and that what kind of cognitive agent you are depends on the body, basically. I wonder sort of how this relates to knowledge and what can be known, what a system can know about its environment or the rest of reality. Can it actually like know everything if it is limited by a particular kind of body?
Let me ask you this. I mean, even connecting to Deutsch, would it be the case that the system is a single human brain, or would it be the case that the consumer of those explanations
is actually the species of human or the civilization of humans. Like it's a higher order organism that self-organizes to know the universe in
No,
its
because
entirety.
I think Deutsch's argument is that one human should be able, like physically be capable of knowing everything that's knowable. Basically, he shouldn't have to rely on a higher scale cognitive being to be able to process all that information. The only thing he needs help with, like that a human needs help with, is the speed and memory. And we can overcome that through technology. So we can use AI to process all of the individual facts faster, but we should be able to understand the explanations, basically, that come out of that. So we should be able to attain the knowledge, regardless of how complex the thing is.
So just I'll shut up after this. It's just because he distinguishes between knowing and understanding. So
yeah,
it's his claim is that.
Sorry, David.
Please,
he uses the term ironic knowledge. I just wondered how you could put that into the discussion you're having. That's one of the terms that he uses.
I haven't come across that so far when I've been reading him, so I'm actually not sure.
Well, it's certainly in his book. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that reminds me of is it's a while since I read Beginning of Infinity, but I do remember him. Yeah. I can't remember if that was in relation to the Gödel incompleteness theorem, but he was talking about, sort of accepting that, yes, there might be certain things that are unknowable, but they don't have to do with what scale of the system you are or whatever. It's not because we're human that they're unknowable, but that there are unknowable things in the universe. But he says that those things are fundamentally uninteresting, which I also found is an interesting claim, that basically anything we can't know just isn't interesting in the first place. So why bother, basically? And he has some sort of argument about that, which I also don't quite understand. But
okay.
All right. I think there is a question from Andrew Levy. So please, Andrew, unmute yourself and ask ahead.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, that was super interesting. So yeah, thanks for that. So I guess one thing, I've kind of got a question and then like a potential kind of thing for you to also pursue. So you've kind of framed your kind of take on this in terms of some sort of ontological architecture.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could unwrap that a little bit more for me, because it seems everything you're appealing to is formulations that are kind of very enriched in terms of what they say about epistemology rather than the ontology of the system. So it's kind of why is it that you've taken that perspective rather than kind of being epistemological architectures?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of find them linked in a sense because again, like sort of what system you are, what you are ontologically seems kind of fundamental to what you can know. But the place where the ontological architecture's perspective just came out of was again sort of reading both Karl Friston and then especially Michael Levin, and sort of seeing how as things that exist ontologically going up the scales from fundamental particles and then going up through molecules and cells and so on. Obviously, us as humans and us as organisms, at some point, life, as we understand it, didn't exist, obviously. And so I think it's just kind of interesting to think of what nature itself is sort of doing is creating this machinery, the way that Levin talks about it, what like cells actually are, is creating machinery that then can explore a space. And as it explores that space, it finds sort of useful pointers and hooks. So as it finds a useful shape, for example, as particular cell collectives find a shape like the planaria finding the horns or some sort of evolutionary feature that helps it survive longer, then that's like a new hook and a pointer, and then that allows it to explore further and allows it to explore further. And so basically there's this idea that what nature is doing is that there's these pre-existing spaces, these scales that go ever upwards, that at the beginning of reality, we sort of didn't have access to them. But as we build these machinery, they can explore the space. And that's why I call it an architecture, right? You slowly build up an architecture. So it's like you're building new floors, and now you can explore this floor, and you can build a new sort of ramp upwards, and now you can explore this floor, and you keep doing that upwards and upwards. So that's sort of where just the idea of calling it that came from.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. Great. And yes, and just the other thing that I thought might be useful here in terms of obviously, you're trying to integrate many people's works here. So have you yet dabbled with David Deutsch's and his constructor theory?
Not much, no. I've only really listened to interviews with him talk about constructor theory, but I haven't read deeply about it yet.
I wonder if when you're trying to address this question that is the universe principally mechanistic or informational. So I think the constructor theory may speak to that in terms of it's a bit of both, as you might expect with this sort of stuff. So with constructor theory, he's trying to generalize or make the universalization of computation to things to the actual tasks it can also perform in a system.
Right.
So, obviously we've got information encoding it, and what are you actually going to do with that kind of information? So the typical the archetypal constructor, you can think of as like a catalyst, something that's, there's a reaction already taking place, but there's something that can, append to this reaction, so it could go faster and something like that. And something I've always found useful, in terms of like trying to simplify what constructor theory actually is there's like a kind of like a 2x2 grid. It says it's similar to kind of active inference in the sense that it's just simply a description of an input-output system. And you can think of the input to the system as being either abstract or being something physical, and the output of the system also being abstract or physical. So if the input is, let me see if I can get this right now. So if let's say the input is physical and the output is abstract, you would say that the thing that's been performed there is a measurement. Or if the input was abstract and the output was abstract, you would call that a computation. And then if the input was physical and the output was physical, you would say that's the construction of another constructor. And I'm missing something. If it's physical, if the input, I forgot what it is, but anyway, I can send you the article.
Yes, please. That sounds fascinating.
On that. And the other aspect of constructor theory, what he's trying to get at, is this idea that the most interesting theories of physics is trying to get at what is possible and what's not possible. So, so much like for him, like the uninteresting questions are like, if your theories are highly sensitive to initial conditions, then you've got a very context sensitive theory where he's trying to say, what are these universal theories which are invariant to the initial conditions, also the scale of the system. So that kind of really speaks more to these kind of principles of conservation, and not really the dynamical laws. Like you'd expect the kind of laws of motion to emerge from the system, from your explanation. So with his I've forgotten her name now, Carla, I think it's Carlos Maletti. They've done lots of work looking at like how to take information theory and thermodynamics and make these universal, because one of the issues with thermodynamics is it's scale variant, and then they've actually managed to provide a formulation which makes it scale invariant. And so that, I think, speaks to the fact that the universe is both informational and mechanistic. It just you need to so it's always with these things. I think the answer is inevitably when there's some ambiguity, it's the perspective, right? What's the starting point? What's the your kind of the objective, what's the perspective that you're taking, and from there it's going to you're going to take one bias over the other. But my feeling is it's always going to be both, at its most abstract form.
That's really interesting. That's fascinating. Yeah, please do send me anything you recommend I read on that, because that sounds really useful for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So next we have Patrice Duquette. So please unmute yourself. Oh, thank you.
Hi. A very interesting presentation. I'm a psychiatrist, also not a computational neuroscientist, so it kind of brought up some things that link together different ideas that I do know, having presented and written on such ideas as Karl's. I found myself, so I'm in America, and we just elected and inaugurated a new president. And so I'm on the distraught side. We'll just start there. So you said about deglobalization, sparser connections. So agreed, okay? And that's one of his premises. But within the spaces of deglobalization, you get increased connections, such as parties that elect this. So I'm always here, and when I can be here, to bring in feelings and emotion. into wherever and whatever you're doing there, because I think it has to be emotions that then within those places, which one, according to the principle, should stay not so intimately connected, should stay more sparsely connected. But as we saw yesterday, they're intimately connected in those areas would have deglobalized themselves, supposedly. So I don't know where you'll put it in your ideas, and I don't know if it has any space in this article, but I think it has some saying. I'd also like to say, how are you using the word cognitive to encompass all that you've encompassed? Because like when
I
you're
basically,
speaking,
yeah, I mean, I basically just use the word cognitive in the sense of if a system is processing information in order to then take an action, if the system sort of has an action perception loop and an information processing loop, then it's a sort of cognitive system. And it's I also sort of stuck to using the word cognitive for the most part, as opposed to saying something like minds, which I know is what like Levin says, which is, you know, more or less the same thing. But I know that when you speak to some people, and for me as a journalist who's going to try to communicate this to lay people get sort of freaked out if you start to say, you know, what if these systems are conscious? That's like the max, like that'll freak people out the most. If you call it conscious, then maybe if you call it a mind or you call it intelligent, that's like another level. They'll freak out a little bit. If you call it cognitive, it's a bit more, I think it's easier to swallow that a system has some sort of cognition, perhaps, or at least there's processing information. So it's just sort of a balance of like what word to choose in order to give off this idea that all these systems at different scales have information processing abilities. They are cognitive and they are minds in a sense, rather than just that being exclusive to human beings or animals.
yeah, I understanding that, yes, I would agree, but so that there isn't further confusion, I think you have to define that at the very beginning as to how you're using it, because it isn't the common way that we'd understand it. But I understand what you're saying now, that it's a level of how can you think about it.
Yeah.
But so very interesting.
Yeah, I
presentation.
definitely think it's I'll probably have to define a lot of systems quite carefully, I think, in going through the way I do this article. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what you said about in terms of the politics part as well, because I don't think I've really got into this, but when I was talking to Karl, like you said, just because you get deglobalization doesn't mean that you get decreased communication per se. It's a different kind of communication, right? When you have sparse connectivity. And one of the things that we sort of talked about is that it seems to be that it's a lot more of a stable structure, where if you're imagining this kind of hierarchical, like a triangle that has nested Markov blankets inside of it, you know, and that whole structure is a lot more stable if it has many little like blankets, many little structures inside of it that are more tightly linked to each other and communicate loads between each other, than if you have many sort of large ones, because then I mean, it's one of the concerns with globalization, right? Is if you have a really, really large institution that's in charge of like way more stuff, and that institution fails, then the whole system fails. It collapses. It's like it falls over on itself, right? It's like if you have literally a building that's held up by one really big thing. Sure, it's really big and solid, but if it crashes, then the whole thing crashes, right? Whereas if you have loads of little supports, then one crashes, then the rest of the structure can sort of hold, and it's easier to replace. So basically, the idea then you can sort of take from the free energy principle that probably having smaller communities that are very tightly linked, that then sort of slowly scale into bigger kind of institutions and are supported by those smaller communities is a lot more sustainable than in a sense what we have now, which seems to be, you know, mediated by social media, everyone talking to everyone far too much in this kind of way that we're doing now.
I'm going to try to remember what you said and tell it to many of my friends, because the smaller community aspect of it, especially considering, yeah, social media and also the other things that triangle that you described seem to like, it's interesting, like how do you break into the Markov blanket is what I'm thinking, but we'll see. Hopefully we can. So
that was, it's really that part of the free energy principle that first made me go to Karl, because Noema, this particular magazine, it's published by this institute called the Berggruen Institute, and they've become, I don't know if any of you have ever heard about them, but they've recently put on these conferences, for example, that they call the Planetary Conference, and they're interested in this concept of planetary computation, stuff like that, and the whole planet becoming like another computer, and that we, in order to solve global problems, planetary problems like climate change, we need to have planetary-sized institutions. And so they want to sort of revive this idea of a kind of globalization, but also look at why did globalization fail. And so I think, but they've never talked about the free energy principle. I've never ever seen them talk about it. And I went to one of the conferences and no one seemed to know about it, weirdly. But I feel like the free energy principle, again, and the ideas that come out of that here give you an idea that, well, if we are going to have planetary-sized institutions and we're going to become a sort of planetary-sized unified society of some sort, then you have to understand this idea of sparse connectivity and this nested structure if you want to create something sustainable, as opposed to what happened with the sort of globalization project.
I was just running off different things in terms of, again, the basic idea that the only way we can know the world is through our senses. And all politics is personal. I'm thinking like the globalization element works against that, but also it's very difficult on the individual scale to continue impressing upon people the only way we know the world is through our senses. And again, my work, I'm a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, it's emotion. And the person before who was talking about the abstract coming in and going out, that kind of thing. I don't know how you would address it in the high level that you're talking at, but I think it is something that you'll want to address somewhere for people to recognize more as to why it doesn't work or does work. Yeah. So cool. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Patrice. Are there any other question? I think Andrew Levy just raised his hand again. So Andrew, please go ahead.
Yeah, just on that note, something else that I thought might be nice here to try and like weave things together from some people's work. So Michael Levin's done a lot of work with gap junctions. So these are when you have neighboring cells, you've got this kind of like, tunneling between them, which is permeable to certain molecules of a certain size. And yeah, Michael likes to talk about this in terms of, these kind of leaks in the boundaries essentially means that cells can't disambiguate who generated the signal. So you think about optimal cells, it's the calcium waves, right? So, if there's something has happened on one of the membranes and this calcium wave that's signaling saying something's toxic, something's not good right now, that will diffuse to all the neighboring cells for them to respond to it. But none of those cells know, who's actually dealing with the traumatic response. And it strikes me that you can kind of blow that up to the level of societies and cultures, right? So you can think about perhaps empathy and sympathy are our leaky boundaries, right? The fact that we get contaminated by other people's emotions, right? And we can't disambiguate between why am I feeling bad right now when I'm in a room of everyone feeling sad, right? There's this kind of a basis for empathy. And it makes me think of I forget who the author is now, but someone I've heard quite a bit on Sam Harris's podcast about this case against empathy, and it's about how the fact we're really bad at scaling up our empathy. So like if there's something happening in our immediate surroundings, our family, we've got a very strong sense of empathy, and we're have this motivation to do something about it. But once you get up to the level of kind of refugee crisis levels stuff, and we're just reading statistics about it, we can't generate any sort of empathic response to it, right? And I think there's perhaps something interesting there, that like with gap junctions, it's dependent on diffusion-like processes, right? It can only get communicated to neighboring cells. It's not going to be 10 or 20 cells apart. And perhaps there's something similar with our empathy, right? We can only get it based on the kind of like local diffusion kind of processes, but not further afield. And perhaps because now we're bombarded with things happening everywhere in the world, right? And it kind of overwhelms us, and we kind of get numbed to all the kind of things that are happening in the world.
Well, I guess you can also take like the other side where people do feel a lot of empathy to things that they see that are happening that are extremely remote to them, but then the fact that it is remote to them and they don't have a lot of possibilities for taking action to actually help that situation that slowly leads to desensitization, but also, a spreading thin, right, of empathy and an inability to then actually focus on the things that are local to you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Michael?
Thank you.
Yeah, just taking this one step further, you did mention the arts just very briefly, but it is rather important, and you keep on bringing up Platonic solids, which seem to go back an awful long way. And of course, the triangle is fascinating because it's the most stable structure in the universe. And I don't know if you know the work of Buckmaster Fuller and his geodesic domes. I mean, it's all created from triangles, and that doesn't fall down. But just looking at what we've been talking about, the postmodern artists, the Impressionists, classically Cézanne, who actually broke up the environment that he was absorbed in and lived in. And he himself said his art was composed of cylinders, spheres and cones. And of course, what he did, particularly when he was doing the pictures of the environment around him, he actually, from those basics, built up complex fields, which people have an affordance, if you like, for with this work. And so I was just adding a little bit to what you were saying, but there are so many different levels that what you're talking about influenced artists. And to some extent, artists influenced the scientists.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's the amount of angles that I could take on this at some point maybe I should turn it into a book instead of an article. I don't know, but I'll have to learn a lot more to be able to do that. But yeah, absolutely agree.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So are there any other questions? If not, maybe I will just end this Q&A session by remarking on an interesting factoid. At some point, you invoked the work by 't Hooft and Susskind, 't Hooft 1993, Susskind 1995 on the holographic principle. Well, the story behind that is that it got initiated in the 70s by the work of Jakob Bekenstein on trying to compute and make sense of the slogan, if you want, of information is physical. And ultimately, the idea that you mentioned there is that there is a finite amount of information that can be stored per unit. In this case, you went to the Planck scale. So that means one Planck scale holds 1/4 of a bit. So you need 4 Planck areas. One Planck area holds 1/4 of a bit. So for 1 bit, you need at least 4 Planck areas. And that was the Bekenstein bound. And then that was generalized further to space-time. And then it was the final generalization, as far as I know, is the covariant entropy bound by Raphael Boso in 1999. So that was for arbitrary spacetimes. So those developments, importantly, were in the physics of black hole. So black holes. Right. So where it's the extreme physics where you can press the boundary, like kind of theorize on the boundary of what's universally achievable. So if you were to use those equations that tell you what would happen to a brain, for instance, if you enclose it in the smallest sphere that can be enclosed into, and then you take the area of that sphere, and then you plug in the let's say the final Boso inequality, and then you try to see what's the entropy capacity of the brain. I tried calculated how much the brain approaches the Boso bound, which is a universal entropy bound. If it go past that bound, it creates a singularity. So the brain, as far as my rough calculations, I never published them anywhere, just playing with equations, is something like 10 to the 51 power under that bound. Okay. So it's vastly under that bound, because the brain is on a low energy regime. So these kind of considerations are very interesting to think about, like the holographic principle, how much, because you can encode the entire 3-dimensional physical theory of an arbitrary system on a 2-dimensional theory formed on the boundary of that system and so on. That's all nice, but it doesn't apply to the kind of system that we're interested in.
I'll say, actually, and I should, you could probably help me understand as well, because, I got Chris Fields' explanation of the holographic principle in the context of our conversation. But then when I tried to read up about it afterwards, it was a bit difficult to square, because Chris Field said that, it means that if the system has a boundary, then the amount of information that you can know about it is what's encoded on the boundary, and that's finite. But then when I was reading like the black hole stuff, and the universe might be a 2D plane that projects into 3D the way we perceive it, and all of that. That what the holographic principle says is that something about like all the information you need to know about a black hole or something, it can be encoded on the surface. So as you can say the opposite of what Chris Fields said. So I was actually quite confused about that. I just said Chris Fields' interpretation, but I don't know if you can help me to square that.
Well, yeah, but let's not take away. Maybe we can discuss this between us.
That'd be great.
I took away too much of the Q&A time. So with that being said, I suspect it is Karl's turn now.
Good. So it's my turn now, is it?
It seems so, Karl.
Okay. So you'd like me to summarize all of that in 30 minutes? Which of course I can't.
I'm not sure. I'm not putting this bound on you. Speaking of both of bound.
Well, as Robert says, there's so much to pick from. Where to start? I think just picking up on the holographic screen and the Markov blanket and sparsity and the geopolitical and Patrice's distraught disposition at the present time in our politics. I only understand the holographic principle through the eyes of Chris Fields, and that would certainly speak to the fact that there is a bulk on the other side on the interior of a holographic screen, which will have many more degrees of freedom of a particular sort than the classical information that is written to the holographic holographic screen, and on that view. And of course, there will be a bulk on the outside as well. So that's quite important from the point of view of the free energy principle. We're talking about how do you disambiguate or separate or distinguish two systems that are quantum disentangled, classically conditionally independent. So it's not, one always has to remember there's a bulk on both sides. That view, I think, usefully informs the interesting debate about what is globalization, what is connectivity of the kind afforded by social media, or just having the capacity to see the suffering in Gaza and to empathize or not with the suffering in Gaza, just being able to see that through news reporting. I think that it would be useful to look at the holographic screen as effectively a kind of information bottleneck. And another perspective, or that perspective also applies to the Markov blanket. It is an informational restriction through which you see another world. And crucially, that seeing is reciprocal. So you have to have, if you're a dynamical system theorist, you'd have to have a generalized synchrony between the bulk on both sides, or the internal and the external states, that is mediated by this very, very narrow, sparse exchange or coupling. So it's not just a question of having a gap junction to the universe. It is having the kind of gap junction that enables you to synchronize with whatever that particular gap junction is talking about. So there's an inherent circular causality and reciprocity, and this is manifest in many ways, even to the extent that there is actually a mutual information theoretic principle called the information bottleneck principle, which is very closely related to the free energy principle, and explicitly in terms of the thermodynamics of prediction and predictive coding. Interestingly, when read in the way that people like Suzanne Still and Gavin Crooks articulated, the bottleneck is actually the present, and it's really the bulk of the past coupling to the bulk of the future. That basically means that one of the simplest instances of a Markov blanket is the present moment in time, in the sense, because we live in a Markovian universe, the future is conditionally independent of the past, given the present. So this notion of sparsity as evinced by the existence of things and thereby implicitly Markov blankets, really does point to this this bottleneck on reciprocal and mutual exchange and sort of dynamical or physics sympathy and empathy. And the reason I say that is, now I'm going to try and reduce, if Patrice is still here, her cognitive dissonance, but I'm going to render her increasingly distraught. So what I think Patrice was referring to was this, in relation to deglobalization, was not the, if you like, the reinstatement of sparse, mutually informed reciprocal coupling of a familial sort, the kind that, you know, the special relationships that we have in our families and in our communities and on our street or in our workplace. What we're talking about is isolationism. So isolationism here is basically a statement that there was previously a Markov blanket, but now I'm now making that two-way traffic one way. I'm breaking the synchrony and the circular causality. I'm now rendering myself insensitive to what's going on outside. Now that kind of pathology of sparsity and Markov blankets or holographic screens is exactly the kind of pathology that Mike Levin talks about when he talks about cancer. So isolationism means being insensitive to your boundaries. So, for example, acting towards a world where Iceland suddenly becomes within the boundary of, sorry, my apologies, Greenland becomes you know, within, or the Panama Canal. This is only possible if you can completely ignore the consequences of acting in a way that is not respecting the bulk on the other side of the system. And of course, that's just an expression of cancer. The cancer has just lost a sensibility to its exterior milieu that is constituted by other cells. It just doesn't know to stop growing. It doesn't know its place. So I would say, Patrice, I wouldn't worry about Trump in the sense of deglobalization. I'd worry about it in the sense of isolationism, because that induces neoplasia, and that can be very destructive. And I think that's the dangerous thing about Trump. Another interesting aspect of that was the discussion about empathy, and I thought it was a really interesting. You should write a whole chapter on that. Yeah. So to empathize is to, in my world, and my world in this instance being sort of computational psychiatry that inherits from active inference and application of the free energy principle, is to be able to infer that you are like me. And if I can infer that you are like me, I can then infer that your generative model, your world model, is isomorphic to my world model. And therefore, I can infer your belief states on the basis of my belief states, because we have a shared sensorium or a shared eco-niche or environment. But of course, that's just a hypothesis. And I can only have empathy with you if I now infer that you are like me. If I infer that you are not like me, I cannot have empathy with you because you are not human in the sense that I am human. And therefore, I have to dehumanize you. And I can't have empathy with something that is not human. And therefore, you can now understand the dangers of polarization, another aspect of something like Trump, as effectively instantiating a situation where there are two groups, each mutually inferring that the other group, members of the other group, are not like them, and therefore there can be no empathy. And therefore, ultimately, each group will dehumanize each other group and not even bother exchanging. And one could look at that as a sort of metaphor for a lot of sort of warlike behavior that goes on. So there's a necessary, and there's some really interesting connections with that kind of, you might say, pathology. That would be a not dispassionate way of looking at it. But certainly when you get that kind of sensory attenuation in neurophysiology and in neurology, for example, then there are, if you like, basic principles that underwrite why it has to be like that. So, if I am prosecuting war on another group, to do that, I have to infer that they are not like me and they are not human. In order to do that, I have to attenuate any evidence that they are like me. So that means if I was reading this physiologically, I have to invoke sensory attenuation, which means that I now become insensitive. So sensory attenuation, for those non-psychologists here, is the fundamental phenomena that you attenuate the consequences of your action, so that I can't really hear myself speak in the same way that I can hear you speak. When I make a saccadic eye movement, during the period of actually acting upon the world and moving the eye, I cannot see. I attenuate all the sensory evidence, simply because if I didn't, I would have evidence that I was not moving my eye, or I was not moving at all, and that would cause me to update my Bayesian beliefs about my override my prior intentions that I was going to move. So to act, either to prosecute war or to move your eyes, you have to attenuate any information about the consequences of that action, and certainly in the geopolitical context or interpersonal or dyadic and possibly a sort of cultural context, that's going to necessarily preclude empathy. I can't empathize with the world when I'm actually moving my eyes across it, because the optic flow is uninterpretable. So I think there's a really interesting whole series of quite fine-grained specifications about what it is to couple with a world, whilst at the same time maintaining yourself separate and sustain your Markov blanket or your holographic screen or your gap junction when when engaging or coupling to the world at many different levels. I'm talking fast because I've used up about 12 minutes of my 30 minutes. Just a couple of fun things before. So right, I'm assuming, I didn't realize this, but I'm assuming that you're going to write an article, but I thought you'd probably already written lots of articles, but you're going to write an article. I would certainly make this into a book. I mean, there's more than enough, certainly a long monograph at least. So it doesn't have to be, it can be a pamphlet, but certainly it's going to be, I think, beyond the kind of thing you'd get in Physics of Life reviews.
Yeah. I think my word limit for Noema, they do very long form, but I think they do sort of maximum 10,000 words, something like that. So I was going to treat it originally as sort of like a decent sort of bachelor project sort of thing. But I also know that even within 10,000 words, all the things you could talk about around this would be very limited.
Yeah, well, I mean, you should certainly do the sort of 10,000 word thing, and think about the sort of the lay media, and also I repeat things like Physics of Life reviews or Behavior and Brain Sciences, or things that actually invite putting a target article out there that invite people to comment upon it. That's a really good way to engage people. And there are 8 to 10, I think it's 8,000 for BBS. Possibly more relaxed at Physics of Life reviews, but I think that would have to be picking out a particular theme and a particular point, or perhaps 3 points that you can integrate from a monograph, or that was more like sort of 100,000, well, at least 100 pages, if not more. I think that's. And in the service of that, I mean, it was masterful the way you took us through the different issues. I have picked out some papers that you actually mentioned, just for the people who are looking at the recording or in the audience, that you mentioned, just to sort of give them a source for background reading, and other papers that provide potential substance and points of reference for some of the things you said. Not all of the things, but just the things that, as you were talking, I thought, oh, that's interesting, that relates very, very much to that. But before I do that, I just wanted to show you a couple of fun things. If I can share my screen, and then at the end, I'd like to go back to your three big questions, because I think they all have very, very clear answers. And I suspect that the answers, it was interesting that you spent the denouement of the presentation talking about Deutsch and asking, does this make any sense in relation to things that have been said before? I take the point it is probably a very beautiful writer and very theoretical, but I think the consensus is it makes absolutely no sense in relation to anything else that I'm aware of. And one could
I like an unambiguous answer. That's okay. Cool.
Yeah,
It'll be great to dig into that a little bit. Yeah.
Well, just for my edification, I mean, he's clearly a philosopher. Does he actually have a maths training or a physics training?
Physics, I believe so. Yeah.
Oh, really?
I don't know. I think I've heard him say. I've heard him say that he's not a mathematician.
Are you asking about David Deutsch?
Yes.
But I mean, he's a
David Deutsch is the founder of quantum information
quantum
theory.
computers. Yeah.
Quantum computing. Like he in 1985 he published a paper that proved that there can be a quantum universal computer by rehashing the proof that Turing did. So he's
Really?
quite the father of quantum information theory.
I didn't know that, but forgive me. Yeah, I have to confess, I'm sometimes an intellectual thug. I only know my own field. I didn't know that. So the reason I asked was that some of his, some of the things he wrote down were just completely nonsensical. The kind of thing you'd forgive of a philosopher, but somebody who'd actually had a maths training.
Yeah, I mean, I was very curious, especially about when he says that scientific progress happens through this kind of explanatory knowledge that is not Bayesian, for example. I would really love your thoughts on that.
I mean, the just phrase Bayesian mechanics is not only dismisses that whole axiomatic predicate of any of those kinds of arguments, but also addresses your question number one. But we'll come back to that. I'm just making the point that your talk invited lots of impassioned arguments about Deutsch versus Levin. I think there are bigger issues at stake. I think you can. My apologies to Deutsch, but I think you can dismiss much of those arguments. But you can certainly appeal to quantum information theory as a vindication of the more generic arguments of the kind that Chris Fields would interpret, I presume now. Deutsch. For my interest, when it's Church, Turing, Deutsch, who is the Church?
Do you know the first name, Robert?
Alonzo Church. 1934, he published a paper just a few months before Turing, and both they ushered the whole new notion of computation in that same year.
Ah, right. Was he a member of the Ratio Club, Robert?
I am not sure on that. I think he might have been, yes, but I'm not positively sure.
It rings a bell. The reason I asked that is that so kind of you might want to Wikipedia the Ratio Club, which I'm not sure that Professor Trimble knows about this, but the Ratio Club used to meet at Queen Square and included people like Alan Turing and David McKay, and I think even Horace Barlow as a young man, and a number of other good and greats, but also crucially Roche Ashby. So this was a joint endeavor that preempted the notion of a Turing machine that very much inherited from Turing's perspective on computation and Ashby's formulation of self-organization to the cybernetics, at the same time that things like the good regulator theorem and the law of requisite variety were being elaborated, which you can regard as sort of forerunners of embodied cognition or things that would completely preclude the notion of humans as a universal computer. It was the antithesis of sort of cybernetics, and remains so nowadays. The equivalent now, I would imagine, would be found in the notion of mortal computation. So, Gunnar, have you read much around mortal computation?
No, I have not.
I think that would sort of provide you with a very clear answer about questions about sort of humans as universal computers. it would be the computer science. It's a phrase actually introduced by Jeff Hinton, making the point that software can be immortal in the sense that it can be run on any infrastructure, any substrate. But that doesn't actually exist in the sense that mortal computation is the computation is inherent on the hardware in which it is embodied and
Right.
a process that is written on that physical substrate, whether classical or quantum. So the notion of mortal computation would be, if you like, the sort of computer science, artificial intelligence version of being situated and embodied, and then you get various flavors like neuromorphic computation, and ironically quantum computation is seen as the ultimate in mortal computation. So I don't know how you link that back to quantum information theory as the motivation for a universal computer. The other reason I was so dismissive of Deutsch, and forgive me, I didn't realize he was the father of quantum information theory, is that universal computation has a very precise and specific meaning, which I cannot reconcile with the way that you presented him talking about it. Universal computation inherits from something called Solomon induction, that itself inherits from cohomologous complexity and complexity information theory of computation that is predicated on the law of large numbers and computational algorithmic complexity that goes right back to cohomologous. Has very, very close links with the free energy principle in the sense that they both emphasize compression. And that compression is important because it is exactly the same kind of compression that is requisite of the coupling across the Markov blanket or holographic screen. So remember, before I was using the word bottleneck, the whole point of the bottleneck is that it is a manifestation, or it looks like you're compressing the exchange between these two interiors and exteriors. So you're compressing everything out there onto the holographic screen or onto your sensorium or your sensory organs, and then you're unpacking it and making sense of it. So this notion of compression is incredibly important, and the compression part is exactly what underwrites theories of computation based upon cohomologous complexity, coming out in two flavors: minimum description length and minimum message length of a Turing-like sort. That then gave rise over the subsequent decades to the notion of universal computation. So I suspect that Deutsch has got a completely different semantic in mind when he talks about universal computation, which may or may not be related to this this more sort of legacy pointing or historical or algorithmic complexity approach. Well, now let's go back to the fun bit. So let me grab share my screen if I can. We just want to share the screen. I'm hoping you can see this. The reason I put this up is because there should be a little movie. So this comes from a paper, the first paper that Mike and I wrote together. We were introduced by Giovanni Pizzullo. And it just speaks to things that you were talking about in terms of the tadpole that had been rearranged and then was able to re-engineer and pursue a more normative morphogenesis in a remarkable way that transcends what any one cell could know. And I think he used the phrase getting to the desired endpoint in some way that transcends the ability of any single element in the collective or the ensemble to actually know how to do that. And that was technically or mathematically exactly the point being made in this early paper, in which we were trying to understand how it could possibly be the case that little cells of cells themselves constituting or had the potential to form a structure, a little organ or a particular pattern. How on earth they could do that with in a way that relied upon intracellular communication, and Mike would emphasize the sort of bioelectric communication, and the way that it was done was effectively basically looking at the problem of any given cell or person in a community, equipping them with a pluripotentiality that they could be anything, but they, in their if you like, prescribed genetics and possibly epigenetics, despite this pluripotentiality, it was always conditioned upon given I am where I am. So I can be any kind of cell. I can be an eye, or I can be a leg, or I can be a tail. But if I am in this position and I receive all these bioelectrical signals from that report where I am in an overall structure, then I'm going to be this kind of cell. And if I'm this kind of cell, I'm now going to broadcast to the other kind of cells, I'm this kind of cell. And of course, that means that everybody's broadcasting to each other in an empathetic way, but all signaling, no, I'm here and I'm this kind of thing, and you're there and you're that kind of thing, because we all share the same generative model. Once we know that, basically the problem can be reduced to knowing your place. If you know your place in this communal structure, this community, then you know how to behave. If you know how to behave, you know how to report where you are and what you are, and that provides evidence for everybody else to coalesce and know their place, and then you get the joint free energy minimizing solution. That was a very long-winded excuse to actually show you a little movie of that happening. So here's a little movie that actually shows you how these cells move around, talk to each other in a way that resolves uncertainty about what they should be broadcasting when they find their place. And in this sort of circular causality way, they find their place and infer their place in virtue of the signals they receive from everybody else. So this is purely collective, it's purely federated, because in the absence of everybody else, you wouldn't know where you are. On the other hand, if you weren't there, you wouldn't be able to generate the signals that enabled you to infer where you were. So I thought this was a lovely illustration of this sort of circular causality between scales of organization that spoke exactly to Mike's arguments that there is an aspect of self-organization that cannot be sort of localized or identified with any single member of an ensemble. So I thought that was appropriate to show, just as a bit of visual candy floss. So we've done that one. The other thing that you might want to do is, I recently in confidence reviewed this. So again, I can't see at the moment, perhaps you're down here somewhere. But you were talking about the free will principle and the the Conway-Cochrane theorem. So if you email Chris, I'm sure he'd send you a draft version of this. It's currently under review, but I'm sure he'd send you that, which seems to speak, and he just takes you through a sort of very quickly, but very comprehensively and intuitively, where things like the free will theorem emerge in terms of the light cone. And Michael, I'm sure, generalize this to a cognitive light cone. So I can't send you that because I'm meant to be reviewing it as an independent reviewer. So, but I'm sure Mike and or Chris would send you a copy if you were interested.
Definitely, I'll drop them an email.
Brilliant. Just for those people in the audience or watching the recording, I found this paper particularly useful, if I've got the right one. They wrote a number of papers in the early 20s, emphasizing this sort of scale-free perspective on basal cognition, which I found very compelling. And one of these papers sort of lists a whole series of predictions which either have subsequently been shown to be true, or one can imagine really interesting empirical programs verifying some of their predictions. So I just put that up as a nod to you know, a whole series, a whole little literature which these colleagues put out there, have done for the past half decade, or at least a few years. Have you spoken to Carlo Rovelli?
No, I have not.
We probably don't need to. I mean, he loves talking to people, and he's a complete artist at being able to unpack physics, and particularly quantum physics, in an understandable way. I found this little book, which it's only, I think, 100 or so pages, really useful in terms of debunking a lot of the myths around quantum physics, and the way that he just dissolves all the usual stuff. If you went to watch the Copenhagen play or whatever, and he just dismisses it, dissolves it, just by taking this relational or observational perspective that was implicit in some of your descriptions of the observer from a quantum mechanics point of view. And to cut a long story short, once you realize that Bob and Alice are being observed by somebody else, you've got three people in play. And once you've got three people in play, all these problems, all the paradoxes just dissolve. So the observation is just the way that one particle or person couples to another one. And if you want to talk about Bob and Alice coupling to each other, then you have to understand there's somebody, so you are now a third player in this. And he just unpacks that from the point of view of relational quantum mechanics. I'm not sure whether you could call this quantum information theory or not. You'd have to ask Chris, but this is more straightforward quantum computation, quantum mechanics. And it did for me a little bit what Sir Arthur Eddington's Space-Time and Gravitation did for the populace in relation to relativity. It brought relational and relativistic thinking to the table to understand the physics of the time. And he does so literally in about sort of 10 pages, and you say, oh yes, that's why you don't have to worry about all these well, I was going to say Bell inequalities, but I'm sure the Bell inequalities fair enough in its own little world. Yep.
Karl, if I may interject something for Gunnar on this point of you invoking Helgoland, you should read, if you read the book, Gunnar, this is basically the antithesis of what Deutsch proposes about the interpretation, the Everett many worlds interpretation of quantum theory. Rovelli is actually if you want, is the arch nemesis of that interpretation. Rovelli explains why his relational view makes sense against the Copenhagen one, which was the traditional one, but also the Everettian one. So Deutsch is a proponent of the many world one.
Yeah, because from what I understand, Deutsch argues that it's through the many worlds interpretation that he can actually make these arguments about human explanatory universality and stuff like that. Okay, that's fascinating. Yep. Thank you.
Oh, so I will. If you ever write your chapter on Rovelli versus Deutsch, please send me a copy.
I will.
I can reverse some of my ignorance and intellectual thuggery. Good. So I put this up. Why did I put this up? So this is the most recent sort of classical physics version of that story in terms of relational reading observation in the spirit of quantum physics simply as measurement, as inference, as the process of exchanging with the observed through the Markov blanket or through the holographic screen or through a gap junction. So one can read observation, being the observer, as basically, one can read the free energy principle as a classical physics description of the necessary relationship between the observer and the observed. Just because to be able to distinguish them means you have to induce a separation, which induces a Markov blanket. If these two things are have an attracting set, namely that they exist over a suitable period of time, then there must be a synchronization manifold, and if that exists, then they have to have certain dynamics under random fluctuations, and that just is a description of the free energy principle. And that dynamics can then be described as Bayesian mechanics or Bayesian belief updating. That is, well, no, let's wait until we see your three questions, and then we get the answers. Having said that, though, what this paper takes you by the hand through the what for me is fairly elementary maths. If you're not a mathematician or a physicist, it may not be elementary, but the ideas are unpacked heuristically for you. But the important thing about this is there are different kinds of Markov blankets. There are different kinds of separating yourself from the universe. And some of them lead to a level of sense making, or a kind of Bayesian mechanics that would distinguish, say, you and me or mice from single-celled organisms, or multicellular organisms from single-cellular organisms. And that distinction, interestingly, if you read this paper, rests upon this Markov blankets within Markov blankets argument. So if I've got a nested structure of Markov blankets, and I'm now thinking about the entire multicellular or high-scale Markov blanket perspective. So all the interior Markov blankets are now effectively the internal bulk or the internal state. What that means is that most of the internal states don't have direct access to action. And if they don't have direct access to action, action now becomes a various cause of your sensations. If that's the case, then it must be that there is a description of all the internal dynamics as effectively inferring your own action. And then you get to the notion in psychology of planning, in computer science and control engineering, as planning as inference. There's now a distinction between what you think you are doing in terms of your Bayesian belief updating and what you're actually doing in terms of acting upon the world. And that leads to a different kind of system, which you cannot get with just a single Markov blanket or a single cell. So I thought that might be relevant in terms of, yes, you can always, as Mike would say, as soon as you individuate something from its milieu or its heat bath or its environment or surroundings, you can invoke the free energy principle to say that at some minimal level there is a Bayesian mechanics and therefore there is some kind of basal cognition. But I think there's a slightly more nuanced and informative story that Markov blankets come at different scales and in slightly different structures, and the scaling up implies a certain change in structure, which leads to a different kind of self-organization or interpretation of self-organization. Indeed, this one goes right through to Hofstadter's strange loops, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Okay,
good.
Brilliant.
Oh, that's right. So this is another fun one, but just a practical one. This gentleman here needed to be promoted, and about 4 years ago wrote his thesis that he thought would get into the prestige literature like that. And of course he didn't. And he also thought that by engaging me, it would guarantee getting to the prestige literature like that. So after 4 years, every 6 months, trying to make it into a publishable, actually, no, this has been recorded, I better not say too much. But after we worked very, very hard on this, involving other colleagues who I've never actually met in person, we eventually came up with this, which was accepted about 2 weeks ago. But it does invoke Chris's notions about sort of Gödelian limits on self-understanding. But crucially, this is self-understanding within a scale. And the reason I'm putting it up is it's on Physics of Life Reviews, which means there's an opportunity for you to now comment upon this. So if you read this and you wanted to write a 500,000 word commentary by way of self-advertising, there is an opportunity to do this now. And if you want to do that, then email me and I'll ask the editor-in-chief to send you an invitation. Chris will probably comment upon this because we start off post hoc having so referring explicitly to Gödelian foundations, but I also start off by quoting Chris here. Well, you can adding observational, representational, or control capabilities to a meta-level component of the system cannot, even in principle, lead to a complete meta-level representation of the system as a whole. So this comes from Chris's theorizing. So we were putting that there as one perspective on this question: can you ever understand yourself? I think that this paper basically just addresses: can you understand yourself within a scale? So this is basically, can a brain understand itself? I can understand another brain, and that would be sort of neuroscience, but can I understand my brain? And that's where the Gödelian self-referential aspects come in. I think Chris was, and you were deliberately asking a related, but I think distinct question: can we ever observe scales above and below, and in so doing have internal generative models, hypotheses that explain those observations, that sort of Bayesian coupling or inferential or information theoretic coupling with the different scales? Is that one of your three questions?
That's basically the last question.
All right. Well, we'll come back to that in the end. Then. So, but anyway, I'm not putting this up as a resource at the moment because I don't think it's published. Oh, it must be published because I managed to download it. But more an invitation for you to comment upon it, just to sort of steer the argument in one direction or another. This is a paper I put up. I'm sure you read it, or if not, then I think you'll enjoy it because it just effectively provides you with the maths of how you would write down a scale-free implementation of the free energy principle, written in this instance through the lens of evolution, natural selection, but emphasizing the importance of coupling between slow large scales and fast small scales, so the phenotype and the genotype, for example. But its focus here is really on casting scale freeness using the apparatus of the renormalization group. So it might be that you want to refer to the renormalization group as a sort of mathematical apparatus that holds this kind of scale-free invariance or scale invariance, just over brackets scale-free. A network that has scale invariance can be called scale-free, but scale invariance is a more generic term. And the thing that is invariant is the laws that govern the dynamics, either written as a Lagrangian in classical mechanics or the functional form of the dynamics. Now, the dynamics just are the belief updating, they are the observation, they are the gradient flows from the point of view of the free energy principle on the variational free energy. So that's basically saying the thing that is conserved as you move from one level to the other level, as one level supervenes on the one above, but is also contextualizes the level below in a reciprocal way. You are just replicating exactly the same kind of Bayesian mechanics because you've got exactly the same functional form for the Lagrangian, which is a variational free energy. And that, I think, provides, well, it just provides sort of a physicist's version of a lot of the scale invariant arguments that you will have to entertain when asking questions about can you couple to scales below or higher. I put this up just as a nod to Robin Carhart-Harris, who you mentioned. So we don't have to worry about that at the moment. What's this one for? Federated inference is another perspective using this sort of scale invariant approach. This may or may not be interesting. It's just a demonstration that if you can empathize in virtue of assuming that you and I share in part the same generative model of our shared sensorium or a shared environment, then a free energy minimizing process will naturally lead to the emergence of communication and language, so that we can now effectively, it enables me to see through your eyes and vice versa, and that can reduce uncertainty and reduce that sort of angst that Patrice was talking about from the point of view of getting emotions into the story. So it's a little side story, but for me, I thought very interesting, and speaks to now how we make the inferences that I should accept your posterior beliefs in the service of updating my posterior beliefs. And this brings us back to this polarization and the 50-50 split that you were talking about. This is one of a number of papers coming out, emerging, where people at different levels of detail actually simulate active inference agents that are in communication. And this paper just takes you through the different kinds of polarization and in-group, out-group that emerge under this sort of under the Bayesian mechanics implicit in the free energy principle. So here we've got Trump supporters, and here we've got the poor Democrats. So, and this is as you were intimating, an evolutionary stable solution, which from the point of the free energy principle is just the sort of joint free energy minimizing solution. When you get this kind of coarse draining of the different kinds of people I can be and you can be, you can read polarization really as basically a dyslexia of self-modeling, that I can be blue or I can be red, and there's nothing in between. And under that kind of dyslexia, or then my job is easy. I just infer you're blue, and if you're blue and I'm red, I just I can't speak to you. There's nothing that we share. But if you're red, then I can usefully find out what you've seen, because we have this sort of shared narrative, or this shared generative model. And that leads to this sort of 50-50 split that you were talking about. You were talking about before. Of course, it doesn't have to be that way. Once you've got a self-similar set of communities, and you have a much more nuanced, fine-grained way of inferring what the different ways and intentional stances that people can have, and different emotional states that they can be in. Once you're no longer alexithymic, for example, but now you have a fine-grained understanding of ways of being in a pro-social context, then this kind of solution dissipates, and it becomes much more fractal or self-similar, which is what one aspires to with this nice sparse connectivity with reciprocal exchange. So that was that. Could I now ask you to put your 3 questions up, and then we can answer them, then we can rest. How do I get out of sharing? Let's stop sharing.
There we go. Can you see them here?
Yep. So is the universe fundamentally mechanistic or informational cognitive? And I think, as Andrew was intimating, both. And to me, most simply articulated in terms of everything can be described in terms of Bayesian mechanics. So the Bayesian mechanics was a phrase introduced to make it very clear that quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics, and classical mechanics are all expressions. They're all mechanics, and they're all expressions of exactly the same thing, which is basically a sparsely coupled random dynamical system. And the only difference between these things is that the classical mechanics only applies to very, very big things, where the random fluctuations are averaged away, so that classical mechanics now just pursues Newtonian laws. There's some interesting technical ways of describing this that rest upon the fact you can always decompose dynamics into a dissipative and a non-dissipative or conservative sort, where you're conserving the probability or the energy as you circulate around isopropability or isopotential contours. So you've got this dissipative gradient flow and this conservative solenoidal flow. And as you get bigger, the dissipative part disappears because the random fluctuations average away, and you end up with biorhythms or the circulation of the heavenly bodies, astrophysics, Newtonian mechanics. As you get smaller, the solenoidal part disappears, and everything becomes so random that it occurs so quickly you can only describe it probabilistically, because by the time you've measured it or inferred it, it's gone, it's changed, because things are changing so quickly on a small scale. That's quantum physics. Both of them, though, are just basically expressions of density dynamics with differences in the relative contribution of the dissipative and the non-dissipative part. Thermodynamics is an interesting case. Again, I got a little bit worried when you said that somebody had generalized thermodynamics to everything. You can't do that, because thermodynamics requires a very specific commitment, and that's of exchangeability. So statistical thermodynamics only applies when you can exchange particles or people. When you now, in say, an idealized gas, or Einstein idealized atom or lattice, if you can exchange things, then you can apply statistical mechanics. Unfortunately, you can't really do that in the life sciences, because you and I are not exchangeable, and certainly me and the artifacts around me and things at different scales, and the air I breathe and the things I eat are certainly not exchangeable. You can't swap me for my meal. So statistical thermodynamics, really interesting, and obviously, from the point of view of practical application of science, it's terribly, terribly important. But as the right kind of mechanics to describe non-equilibrium and self-organization, it's a big constraint, and I'm surprised to hear somebody has generalized it, because the whole point of it is it is not general. It very specifically applies to lots of small, identical, exchangeable things. The Bayesian mechanics is interesting because it sits between the classical mechanics and the quantum mechanics. So it's got both the dissipative and the solenoidal part, sometimes described as stochastic chaos. But notice in saying that if we evince an interesting kind of Bayesian mechanics, we cannot be the size of planets, nor can we be the size of down to the Planck scale. We actually do sit in a Goldilocks regime, and that's something that Chris and Mike would not necessarily agree with. They think that it's turtles all the way up and turtles all the way down. I'm not sure that's true. I think there is a privileged scale between the very large and the very small, where you've got an interplay between both the dissipative and the non-dissipative or solenoidal parts. And by solenoidal now, I'm now reading solenoidal as oscillations, biorhythms, life cycles, reproduction, replication, all of these things. But in the context, you're never stepping in the same river twice. So this is what I meant by stochastic chaos. So you've got both the dissipative part and the solenoidal part, at the scale at which we live and operate. Might humans be nested inside higher scale cognitive systems? Well, on that argument, no, I'm afraid not. Unless you think the weather has cognitive capacity. No.
Yeah.
And indeed, I'm afraid you can't even say that your institution or your culture really has a cognitive capacity. It certainly plays an important role in cultural niche construction and transgenerational transfer at a slow time scale in setting up the context for cognitive processing, if you limit cognition to the vernacular. If, on the other hand, you define it as you did for Patrice and use it in the Mike Levin sense, then yes, I think you can transcend scales. But I think there's some quite nuanced arguments there. Does here, I mean, you can certainly, and there are papers, Sergio Rubin has written some lovely papers about this, you can certainly apply the free energy principle to the Gaia hypothesis and the biosphere, and you can write down the differential equations and make some quite interesting assertions. But at no point is anybody saying that the ecosystem at that scale is planning ahead. It is certainly responding like a really smart thermostat, and it's self-organizing like a really smart thermostat, but it is not planning. So I think the bright line is, does cognition involve future pointing counterfactuals and selecting among well-formed counterfactuals, i.e. planning, or does it just mean purposeful behavior? So my answer would be ambivalent on that one. E.g. cells nested within the human scale. Yeah, so that's why I thought you might be interested in that sort of pathological formulation that says, yeah, you get different kinds of Markov blankets when you do that nesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
If humans are nested within higher systems, does this imply a limit to human knowledge? Or have humans reached a privileged cognition where all knowledge is, If you stick close to the physics, to use Chris Field's word, the answer is very, very clearly, absolutely applies a human knowledge, in the sense that, can you perceive evolution? Can you observe evolution? No, because you don't live long enough. And this is this scale-free aspect that the Markov blankets have a unique temporal scale, as well as a spatial or abstract state space scale. So the scale above, by definition, is always changing more slowly than the time scale of the things below. So you can never perceive evolution because you don't exist for long enough. Which is why I was making a distinction between, can I know myself at my scale, or can I observe the scale above or the scale below? And I think putting it like that, which you did, I think you mentioned life sciences and sort of physical sciences. I would actually be more explicit and say, with the advent of telescopes and microscopes, we now can tell stories about, say, physics, astrophysics, or many world theories, or quantum physics. These are just stories. They are stories that explain the measurements that we get from either our telescopes or our microscopes, that can usually move up, say, not an order of magnitude, but move up to the next scale, or possibly a couple of orders of magnitude up and down the scales that we can. But notice what's going on here. It means that my observations of the scale above, that have been extended by microscopes and telescopes, are now give me license to create stories and hypotheses via Bayesian mechanics at my scale of existence. And you could argue that quantum mechanics is a story we tell, because the actual to exist at the quantum level means that you would exist on a time scale which was inconceivably short from our perspective. But while I did exist at a quantum scale, from my point of view, I've been well happy with my little life. But from your point of view, it's unmeasurable. It's gone away before you can infer it, simply because of the separation of temporal scales that you get. So I'm not sure about the word privileged. I certainly think it's private. I think the scale in which you operate is private to us. Interesting use of the word privilege. Perhaps it is privileged on the basis of this notion that if you go too big, you become purely conservative and no dissipative dynamics. But if you go too small, then things become so fast and transient. You don't have any sort of life cycles anymore, any biorhythms. So perhaps there is a privilege. Perhaps that's something you should pick out.
Well, I mean, I'm also just thinking in terms of when you said, we can't sort of know evolution because of the timescale thing, and yet we do have theories of evolution based on observations that we made, and then create theories about those observations, right? So I'm wondering sort of how you think about sort of scientific knowledge and things like that we seem to be able to do that as human beings. How does that sort of relate to these?
Well, it's an interesting question. And again, it'd been really interesting to hear how you treat this. This could occupy at least one whole chapter, if not several. So I would answer that. So when I talk about fantasies, I mean scientific hypotheses. So fantasies in the sense of a fantastic organ, in the sense of Andy Clark, or indeed to a certain extent Helmholtz in terms of unconscious inference. So explanations that can never be, that are not truth pointing, they're just explanations to the best. So the other reason I had a slightly allergic reaction to some of the people you're talking about was that, especially that Deutsch person, was this conflation with of Bayesian inference with induction. Bayesian inference is abduction, which means there is no classical inference. There's no inductive logic. It's just abduction. It's
right.
Inference to the best. It's just finding the explanation that renders those measurements the most likely. And certainly
right. Okay. Fascinating.
All archaeological thinking is just creating stories that best accommodate the evidence, archaeological evidence at hand. And if you read the archaeological literature, and I haven't, but I have written with people in the space, it's all arguments. It's an argumentative field, worse than philosophy, where they're just shouting about their hypotheses, their fantasies, and picking out the data that confirms. There is no real science because there's no real evidence other than the historical archaeological evidence at hand. So if science is a process of evidence-based science, and that is an expression of the scientific processes based in belief updating, finding your hypotheses that provide the most likely explanation for these data or render these data the most likely. But to do that, you have to be able to measure, which is my point. You can't measure evolution because you don't last long enough. What you can do is take historical data or records from the past and then infer what might have caused that in the past. But the measurement in and of itself is today, now, while you live as a scientist. So I think there's a subtle distinction between scientific theories about what could explain things and the scientific process of making sense of empirical data and observations. And on that view, I wouldn't say that archaeology is a science, other than it is a science because you have hypotheses about the traces that the past might have left you in terms of the archaeological evidence at hand for your particular theory. But a little bit like evolution, it's it's not a testable hypothesis. So I say you can't perceive evolution. I meant that in the sense you can't test your hypothesis about evolution because you can't go and intervene or measure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
All you can do is have a theory. And so there is no principle of evolution. There's no principle of natural selection. They're just theories that can never be confirmed or disconfirmed.
Yeah. Fascinating.
I may be wrong there, but that's just
because that's kind of a point with the free energy principle as well, right? Is that it's not really directly falsifiable in the general sense.
Well, that's why it's called a principle, not a theory.
Yeah.
It's a principle. It's a law of least action. It's a description of things that you can apply. So in physics, a principle is a method. It's something you apply. It's not a theory or an explanation. It's a tool you apply to things. Whereas evolution is a theory. You don't apply evolution. However, there's a nice something that is shared by evolution and the free energy principle, in that they both comply with themselves. So the theory of evolution has itself evolved, and the free energy principle is the description of things in the simplest way possible, which is what the free energy principle is.
Right. Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Thank you guys so much. This has been absolutely fantastic and so fascinating. Thank you so much again for the invitation.
Right. Thank you, Karl, for your insights. I will spread them around. And by the way, I just couldn't imagine saying the word isolationist about the United States, but have to recognize.
I think it's probably better than, was it deglobalization? You could not accuse Trump of being a deglobalization, which is, I think that's slightly more conciliant with our humanitarian perspective of things. Sorry, so yeah, are you going to write the book now?
I mean, I have to now with the with your encouragement. I feel like I'll have the motivation to. I mean, but yeah, thanks again for all the kind words, and that gives me a lot of motivation that I'm at least onto an interesting track. And this has helped me a lot with the sort of nuance of where I need to sort of expand the arguments. So, but we'll start off with the article, and then we'll see, and maybe expand to a book from there.
Excellent.
So on this note, let's thank our speaker again with another round of applause. And yeah, Gunnar, thank you for talking, and good luck with your article, and see you at the next TMB meeting next week.
Thank you so much.
Good.